Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you. Good morning to you in the United States, good afternoon to you in Europe, and good evening to you in Asia and other regions. So welcome to this webcast today, the Conference Board webcast, and we're looking at the subject of Mind the Mental Gap. And this is the first of a three-part series. And today's is looking at the critical roles of managers and what role they play in initiating and managing the dialogue about mental health within your organisation. So I'm Marion Devine. I'm a senior researcher at the Conference Board, and I'll be your moderator today. And as usual, before we start the webcast, I'll just quickly run through some information for you about today's programme. So please do ask questions as they occur to you via the chat box at the bottom left of your screen. And I'll do my best to weave them into the conversation, at the right time. And if we can't deal with some of them, we'll certainly try and follow up in email with you. But we really welcome your interaction in this. Do feel free to download the presentation on the file download pod in the bottom centre of your screen. You can have full screen with your video or PowerPoint at any time by clicking the four arrows at the top right of the screen. And if you are doing continuing education credits that are being awarded for this webcast, do remember just that you have to be logged on for the duration of the webcast, and that you'll be requested to ask to type in your name and email during the programme. And as always, we ask, would you complete the brief evaluation form at the end, because we really do look at it. And in fact, that's why we're doing these three series. This was based on your feedback from the last webcast in the autumn. Share this programme with your colleagues. It will be available on demand after the webcast at I think that's all we need to cover now. So I would like to introduce my co-speaker today, who is Michelle Cyrus, who is a Senior Fellow with the Conference Board. And I'm delighted to have Michelle today. Michelle has got a very long and esteemed background, starting originally in journalism. He was an international journalist, very much focusing in strategic HRM and strategic management. He's the author of a good 20 books and reports. And he has also done a huge amount, before it became even on people's radar, he's done a huge amount in the whole area of mental health, and particularly in the context of the workplace. He's the founder and trustee of the British charity Bipolar UK. And Michelle himself as well is very open about the fact that in '97 he was diagnosed with a bipolar condition himself. And he's very happy, I think, and very open to speak about that. So welcome, Michelle.
Hi, welcome to you all.
So today I'd like to just sort of, before Michelle starts bringing to us his expertise, his experience of working with organisations to really help line managers and other supervisors and team leaders to equip them to respond to their own people and teams. I'd like to just sort of set a little bit of the context before we start. And I think, Michelle, it just staggers me that we did our last webcast only 4 months ago, and well, in the autumn, in fact. And since that point, COVID-19 has erupted on the scene, and the world was being gripped in this unprecedented crisis and ongoing health issue, and the economic turbulence with it. So the context really, we've gone from what's called a VUCA environment to what Oxford University call a tuna environment, which is turbulent, uncertain, but novel, totally novel, as well as ambiguous. And, we're living through days where companies really have to sort of make it up as they go along and take the best decisions that they can. I think Michelle and I have I think it's interesting for us because after the global financial crisis, we wrote a book together for The Economist on what does it mean to manage uncertainty, and to see something that is sort of different, but is still having seismic waves of uncertainty and turbulence, and understanding that this is it's not something that's going to end anytime soon, and companies are really having to chart through these unnavigated waters. And this has big implications for mental health and well-being. So I think that we certainly believe that this, if anything, this shows us even more the importance of companies really thinking about and supporting mental health and well-being of their employees, not just their employees, but also all those people in that ecosystem around the company, suppliers, maybe contingent workers, valued people, also including them in that. So I think that in the short term, I think everybody around the world has really seen the importance of mental health. We've seen people in lockdown, we've seen people struggling with isolation, anxiety. We've seen people dealing with all sorts of pressures at home, enforced home working. We've seen very alarming spikes in domestic violence. We've seen concerns about the impact that it's having on children, the impact that it's having on the developing brains of teenagers who need a lot of social interaction at this point in their lives. So I think that there's been a real a huge shift in understanding that, we human beings have real needs and we need to be connected with each other. And so I think that's the first I think for me, shift in appreciation is understanding that mental health is a spectrum. It goes all the way from wellness, but the well-being of our physical well-being, our mental, our social well-being, our psychological well-being, and that all of us are on the spectrum. And it can be all sorts of things, situations and events, things outside of our control, all sorts of things that might make us move up that spectrum towards mental ill health. So I think that's certainly what I'm seeing. It's a spectrum. We're all on it, and we all have a stake in this. I think the other thing is that Michelle and I, when we did our last piece of work on managing uncertainty, one of the things that's very clear from the last global crisis is that the impact of something very, very hugely disruptive has some longer term implications for physical and mental health. And there are strong statistics showing that, this plays out over the medium to long term when you see rises in physical disabilities, physical ill health. You see rise in things like attempted suicides and suicide rates, rises in mental ill health. So we see something, COVID-19 is showing us the short-term needs of well-being, but also I think it's really important that companies also appreciate that there will be some long-term consequences playing out too. I think the second thing that I'm seeing from my vantage point in the conference board and having a lot of contact with our councils at the moment, and I've gone and talked to several of them about mental health because of their concern. I think it's become very obvious to me that mental health and well-being is something that cuts across all functions in the HR. It cuts across as well the whole business too. It's a shared responsibility. It's not just HR's responsibility, but it's something that's a shared responsibility with managers, but also with colleagues as well. And I think that through being able to go to some of our councils, we're seeing that mental health and well-being is really, really important in terms of engagement. So teams that are handling engagement and running engagement programs and surveys, who are doing continuous listening and pulse surveys, especially during the COVID crisis, I think that these teams have become really aware that they have to factor in well-being and mental health as part of that process of maximising engagement and understanding, the impact of some very unexpected and difficult experiences for people. It's also something we also have companies that are going into employee experience and designing around employee experience. You can't ignore mental health and well-being if you are looking at experience, and so that has to be probably hard baked into some of those approaches. And when these companies are redesigning employee experiences, they have to look at it through the lens as well of well-being and mental health. I think it's also something that we've become very aware that it's so linked to inclusion, that your mental health and your well-being is linked very much to your feeling of whether you are being included or excluded, whether you feel a sense of belonging to your organisation, a sense of being able to be your authentic self, a sense of being respected. So again, that's so linked to well-being and to someone's mental health. So I think that it's very obvious to me that it has to be an enterprise-wide solution and an enterprise way of thinking about it. I'd also urge people in talent not to forget about it, because sometimes there's an assumption that high-performing people are fine, and they need also to have some support. And it might well be that some of your particular high performers may find it very hard to share about their struggles. So that's really my sense of the context. But I think it would be great at this a moment to stop and take a poll. So we thought we'd have a poll today, just sort of finding out from you whether you think there has been a change in the awareness about the importance of mental health and well-being. So I hope you can see up on your screen our first question, very simple question. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, has the mental health and well-being of employees in your organisation received greater priority? And I can see that you're already starting to vote, so that's good. So in a minute, we'll get the full results. Okay, so I think we're just about done. So can we share the poll, please, with everybody? Okay, thank you. So we have a very, very strong result. Michelle, do you want to make any comment about that? Just to put you on the spot totally, but 74% saying yes.
Yes, I think it's very indicative of the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has placed mental health and well-being at the top of people's priorities at the moment, and it's one of the reasons why we're doing these webcasts. And it's very, I don't know whether I would saying gratifying is a positive or negative thing, but it's very gratifying to see that our instincts are correct on this, and that the mental health and well-being is as important to people who are registered on this webcast as it is to us.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I think I'd like to now put up the second question, because we know that a commitment and a sense of priority is one thing, but actually following this through with some perhaps quite hard decisions about whether to invest. Do you think that your company will invest more resources into mental well-being programs, initiatives in the next 12 months? Are we going to see some big changes here? So you're all voting. I'll give you just a little bit longer. Okay, I think we're... Looks like some of you are changing your minds. Okay, I think we'll close the poll now, and if we can share it with everybody. So it looks like that's a harder question for you. So we're saying that nearly half of you say yes, but there's still quite a significant amount, percentage saying not sure and possibly not. So I guess that just fixes us in the reality of corporate life, and obviously the fact as well that COVID-19, some companies are really, really struggling financially. There are some very hard decisions that they have to make about their investments and their resources. So I think we can safely say that perhaps there is a very big shift in mindset in large organizations, but whether or not they're in a position to carry it through and to make some solid investments is up for question. So without more ado, I'd like to turn over now to Michelle. I've talked about how mental health and well-being has to be an enterprise-wide responsibility. It's something that needs joined up thinking from HR and all those people in different pockets of the HR organisation to come together. But today we really want to focus on the fact that a really pivotal figure in this whole scene is someone who is a line manager, team leader, supervisor, but someone who is managing a team of people. And Michelle's going to share his insights in this area. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, and lovely to be here. And there are about 3 points that I want, based on Marion's introduction, that I want to reiterate. Firstly, this is very much a personal issue for me, because since 1997, I have had a bipolar diagnosis. At the time, it resulted from a major mental crisis that resulted in me attempting suicide twice, and I have spent the last 20 to 25 years recovering from that, whilst continuing to undertake a career in HR research, journalism, and commentating. And I would welcome, if you have any questions about my own personal perspectives, I would welcome any questions that you may have about that. The second thing is to say that a lot of the insights that I'm going to share with you now are based on work that I have done as a founding member of the Lived Experience Research Collective at the UK Mental Health Foundation, in working with companies in the UK who are looking to improve the efficacy of their corporate mental health policies. So again, I would welcome any questions you might have about that. And the third point I just want to reiterate is Mary and I have worked together for many years, and we are co-authors of 2 books for The Economist, one on managing business uncertainty and the other on managing talent. It's our view that the issues we're going to be talking about today apply as much to those members of your organizations who you see as talented and are part of a fast-track research development program. And again, we're happy to talk about how the issues that we looked at as writers of these books apply to this particular issue. So let's start by saying, why do we feel that line managers are play such an important part? Hang on, let me just. Yeah, a part in pursuing this issue. And I'd like to just again reiterate what Marion said. The word line managers we're using is a kind of catch-all for any other people who are involved in people management, be they team leaders, be they project managers, and supervisors. Anyone really who is in daily contact with staff in their care, because our argument is that these people are in the best position to spot the early signs of mental distress, because they know the people they're working with well, and critically they know what is typical and what is atypical behavior that rings alarm bells in their mind. And probably nobody else in the organization is in a position to make that judgment. And I think it's really important strategically for that to be developed, because early identification of mental health problems means that you can facilitate, as line managers, early corporate interventions and help and combine that with support from families and friends of the individual, from online social support and from possible medical treatment. Early interventions of this kind increases the likelihood of early recovery. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that, particularly with episodic illnesses like my own, the earlier you catch the episode, the earlier you will recover. And it could mean the difference between a few days off work, at most a few weeks off work, rather than if you leave it to fester to a complete crisis, months and months. And this means, the reduction of lengthy disruption and pain for the individual, but also, importantly for organizations, lengthening costly sick leave for the employer. So there are some real cost benefits, not saying that that should be the priority in this case, but it is important to make that point. I think it's also important in the work that Live Experience Research Collective did with UK employers. I think there was a lot of feeling among the HR practitioners that we worked with to feel that, aren't you really loading huge responsibilities onto the line managers on top of what they already have? So I think it's very worthwhile just at this stage delineating what line managers can do and what they cannot do in response to looking after the mental health problems of the people in their care. So what they can do and what we're hoping they will do is to provide sensitive moral support to the person involved, to be able to help that person tap and facilitate expert corporate intervention of a variety of kinds that will help support the individual, to be able to work with specialist HR practitioners and possibly also occupational health experts to identify and implement reasonable adjustments to the individual's working conditions. And I'll be talking about what kind of reasonable adjustments would be involved a little bit later in this presentation, to draw on these adjustments to support the individual's return to work, and to, critically importantly, undertake all of these tasks with the agreement and the collaboration of the individual, and being strictly respectful of his or her wish for confidentiality, which is a critical, important issue. Let's look at what we're not asking line managers to do. We're not asking them to be medical experts. So we're not saying they should in any way try to diagnose the condition. We're not asking them to provide professional counselling. We're not asking them to determine the right medical intervention. That's the work of somebody completely different. And we're not asking them on their own to determine the right level of sickness pay. So we're not in any way suggesting that they should become involved in this as specialist practitioners in mental health. Their role is to identify the problem in its early stages and to refer that person on to the right help. Having said that, I think it's very important that, hang on a second. I think it's very important that, that in fulfilling this role, line managers and anyone who's involved with people management receive the right training and preparation to do that. Because again, one of the major feedbacks we got from the work we did with UK organisations at the UK Mental Health Foundation was that most managers confronted with this problem are not in any way prejudiced against people who have mental health problems. They're just terrified, literally terrified of making the wrong response. They feel completely de-skilled, and in order for them to provide the right responses, they do need the right training. And I think this whole issue was made very clear in a blog that was published by Claire Rowan, Global Director of Mental Health and Wellbeing at Centrica. And in this blog, she said, mental health awareness training for line managers is being delivered to give them the opportunity to build their confidence in having mental health related conversations in the workplace. We shouldn't and can't underestimate the importance of managers feeling confident and able to talk openly about mental health with their team, especially as we encourage individuals to take responsibility for their own well-being. So it is very important that prior to asking line managers to actually undertake this role, they receive the right kind of training. Now, what kind of training might be involved? What sort of issues should we be asking them to focus on? Well, here's a list. We're critically importantly asking them to look at what atypical behaviours they might look for that might ring alarm bells in their head and make them think, there might be something worth investigating here. They need to have the confidence to be able to broach the issue in the right way, in a sensitive way, that in no way panics or scares the person about making any kind of declaration of their problems. They need to be able to respond to any declaration the individual may be made in the right way, and that requires the right kind of training and a blow-by-blow approach. Critically important is the issue of trust and respecting confidentiality. There is a kind of paradox that I will talk about a little bit later, that actually the more you respect confidentiality of people who have mental health problems, the more likely it is that they're going to be open about it in the future. So there is that kind of paradox to deal with. It's really important that the person has the right listening skills. It's equally important, if they don't know already, what kind of corporate support the person can be referred to inside the organization, and the line manager should be aware of that. So, for example, again, drawing on the Centrica case study we did, these include e-learning modules in the case of Centrica for employers and managers, a one-page document outlining all the existing support available, and a very simple sticker displaying contact details for 24/7 mental health support. And during the year, Centrica also has a regular program of mental health awareness meetings to open up the issue of mental health inside the organization. So it's very important that the line managers be able to refer the individual to these programs, and most typically either internal or bought in employee assistance programs includes confidential talk lines, confidential private counselling, and mental health hubs. So, you know, there is usually a great deal of support available for them to draw on. And finally, what reasonable adjustments are available to make possible for the individual to be able to adapt more effectively, and for the organisation to be able to adapt more effectively to the individual's condition. So let's look at two of those issues in a little bit more detail. What kind of atypical behaviours should the line manager be watching for? So these are a list of possible ones that might ring alarm bells in their head. Is the individual unusually more aggressive or confrontational in their teamwork, in their interaction with the people they work for? Is the person unusually withdrawn or internalized in the way that they react to team issues? that goes so far as for the individual to be unusually defensive and brittle in the way that they react to other team comments? Do they become tearful and emotional? Are they in any way morbid and depressive about their prospects of the organisation and their work? And controversially, are they more promiscuous and sexually provocative? Now, the key words here are atypical and unusually, because we're not in any way saying that everybody who is aggressive or confrontational in their teamwork style, or anybody who is promiscuously and sexual provocative and that commits sexual harassment problems, automatically have a mental health problem. But if this behavior, if this aggressive or confrontational behavior, if this promiscuous or sexually provocative behavior is out of character, is unusual for that person, is unprecedented, then that might give an indication that there is something mentally wrong here that should be investigated and that the line managers should investigate. Similarly, some people are very reticent about taking part in team discussions. Others are very confident. If a confident person who is normally energetic and engaged in the way that they conduct team discussions, for example, suddenly becomes unusually withdrawn or internalized, that might be an indication that there is something wrong. So
Michelle,
it's not
could I just ask you, when you say withdrawn, and what do you mean by internalized?
I mean, in the sense that they look at issues that affect them without sharing with other team colleagues, that they become very reticent about opening up where appropriate in team discussions, that they become less confident, that they become less engaged, that they become less participatory, you know. So it's about them internalizing all their emotional problems. So that's what we mean. And I mean, just to take an example from my own father's condition, who suffered from very badly, more than from me, bipolar. He engaged in, during his bipolar episodes, in promiscuous and sexually provocative behavior, which ultimately resulted in in his marriage breaking down. And he was regretful and ashamed of that for the rest of his life. So it's worth stressing that all of these kind of behaviors may be, not must be, but may be indicative of somebody having a mental health problem. Let's look at another issue, which is reasonable adjustments. Now, the term reasonable adjustments is a UK one. It comes from the terminology used in the 2010 Equality Act that was passed in Parliament, which afforded new rights for people with disabilities of all kinds, including, critically, mental health problems. And what the law says is that organizations are under a legal obligation, in the event of a declaration of somebody having a mental health problem, at proposing reasonable adjustments to their working styles. Reasonable being measured in terms of the cost it makes to the organization and the level of disruption it makes to the organization. So there are certain things that obviously the law would take into account aren't appropriate in those circumstances. But we would argue that reasonable adjustments are something that all organizations across all territories covered by the Conference Board should be considering. And the kind of reasonable adjustments that we're talking about in the case of mental health are listed here. It might involve offering, either on a temporary or a permanent basis, more flexible working times. So, for example, starting and finishing times that take the individual outside busy commuting hours. It might involve access to private or quiet working spaces, particularly in the case of open plan offices, so that the person has a chance, if they're feeling threatened by the shared plan office, the chance to retire to somewhere private where they can work in a more peaceful and quiet environment. It might involve flexible options for short work breaks at the discretion of the individual, so that if they're suddenly feeling panicky or they're suddenly feeling anxious, they can take a short 10-minute break to actually help them adjust to this. And this again could be offered for a fixed period of time on a temporary basis or a more permanent basis. It might involve more time off than would be usual for appointments with GPs or consultants and helpful physical or psychological therapies. It might involve temporary or permanent reductions in performance targets, and it might involve temporary or permanent redeployment into a different role if that is what the individual wishes. So these are all sort of possibilities that you might think about in assessing how to best support the individual. Again, we did, I and my wife, in fact, in this case, did work with Centrica, and we were working with their call center staff who were working under great stressful conditions in an open plan office, and access to private or quiet working spaces and flexible options for short work breaks at the discretion of the individual were two options that we discussed with them in some detail.
Michelle, may I ask a question here? Do you think, given that with the lockdown that we've seen across different parts of the world, obviously employers have had to be remarkably flexible, and they've had to really factor in people's individual circumstances. Do you think in a way then that it's not going to be such a stretch to think about reasonable adjustments going forward, given that perhaps they've already really started in this area?
Yes, and I think actually the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of opened up new possibilities for reasonable adjustments for people working at home, because one of the things that we've learnt from the period of lockdown and the period of enforced home working that's happened to many territories over the last 3 months is that line managers need to be much more aware of the home circumstances in which the person is working. So, for example, do they have children at home that would normally be at school? Do they have a partner who's also working? And what kind of distraction is that going to involve to their work? And it also means actually saying, look, as long as the employment targets are met, as long as your performance and targets are met to the agreement that we've made, you can have a little bit more flexibility about when in the day you work and when you don't work. So I think that there are all sorts of new possibilities for reasonable adjustments that specifically apply to home working that we hadn't really considered before.
Mm. And do you also think, as we know that our members at the conference board are now actively planning or in the middle of bringing people back to the physical workplace and just making all sorts of decisions about working arrangements, is it likely that people who perhaps have some issues around anxiety, is it going to be quite hard? Is it worth really thinking about their feelings about returning to the workplace, given that everybody is still very much worried about further outbreaks of the virus?
Yes, I think that is one thing that, and I would stress, I don't think anybody is expecting line managers to make these decisions on their own. I think, the way in which they collaborate with either specialist HR practitioners or specialist occupational health experts that are used by the company in pinpointing, in agreement, and I have to stress this, in agreement with the individual, what kind of reasonable adjustments would be appropriate is going to be the key to whether it's a success or not. And certainly in the wake of lockdown, where people are returning to work with a great deal of anxiety about the safety of themselves and others in terms of a healthy workplace, I think this is an issue that needs to be considered by organisations.
Thank you.
I'd like to finish with 3 issues that are what I've called issues to grapple with, which in our work with UK organisations at the Mental Health Foundation, we have worked with at some depth with organisations who we collaborated with. The first is that in this paradox that I was talking about earlier, that actually encouraging disclosure is important, but at the same time you have to guarantee the person's confidentiality. If that person discloses a mental health condition and asks the line manager to respect confidentiality and not share that information, the organization, within legal boundaries, clearly about their health and safety, need to be able to respect that. And I think there is this kind of paradox that says, actually, the more that you guarantee and respect individuals' confidentiality, the more likely they are to be able to disclose when they're feeling ill and when they're going through the early stages of an episode of their illness. So there is that kind of paradox. Respecting confidentiality actually encourages disclosure. I think the second thing that organizations grapple with is the fact that you're having to manage the recovery of an individual who is neither perfectly well nor perfectly ill. So if a person like myself has a serious episode of their illness, they are going to go through a stage of recovery where some work is going to be welcome to them because it provides them with a welcome focus for their energies. But they are not yet in the position of going back to the same hours or performing the same performance targets as they were in normality. And I think the whole issue of reasonable adjustments tries to address this problem, because traditionally, I think line managers have wanted people who are perfectly well and signed off to work, or perfectly well and recovering at home. And I think there is this kind of middle ground, which is actually mutually beneficial to both the organization and the individual, where the individual, during a agreed period of time, comes back in shorter hours to lower performance targets that gradually, over a staged period of time, graduate upwards to full hours and full targets. And I think grappling that issue of somebody who's neither perfectly well nor perfectly ill is one of the other issues that we found a lot of organizations had trouble dealing with. And I think the third thing, given that some of the behaviors that we're talking about that, for example, bipolar involves, which is that people become more aggressive, more confrontational, and prone to unwitting sexual harassment, there is an important balance to be created in all line managers' duties between the duty of care to all their other staff, whilst at the same time attempting in all circumstances to treat the atypical behavior of this one individual as a health rather than a disciplinary issues. So if somebody, as a result of bipolar, for example, or some other related mood swing disorder, unwittingly sexually harasses somebody at work, you obviously have to respect the individual who is being harassed as much as you respect and care for the person who is doing the harassment. So I think, again, grappling with this balance is something that organizations have to find an answer to, and that we are working with. And again, reasonable adjustments do address that issue to a certain extent. So at this point, again, I would welcome any questions that you have resulting from this presentation, but at this point, I'd like to hand back to Marianne.
Thank you, and I really do encourage people, if you do have questions, please do type them in and we'll address them. I think something that I have a question, Michelle, before I give my offering in this webcast is, when it comes to managers and sort of appraisals, evaluations, do you have any sense about whether this area of their role should be in any way evaluated? I mean, managers are held increasingly to account for the engagement of their teams. Companies are now moving more and more into trying to measure inclusion. So have you got any views about, is this an area that really should not be factored into any sort of leadership or management process?
It is a difficult issue to grapple with, in the sense that I think I'm very conscious from the feedback that we've received at the UK Mental Health Foundation that HR practitioners are extremely reluctant to place overtly too much pressure on line managers to undertake and perform to everyone's satisfaction these important new responsibilities. But at the same time, as a point I might make later on if we have the time, it's very important for us to be able to, as a part of, this is a change management exercise. And basically, it's very important that we have some feedback to go on how effective the organization is going to be in terms of dealing with these issues. So without putting too much pressure on the individual, I think some form of measure of how effective that might be based on, I don't know, 360-degree feedback that might actually help the organization measure whether actually the interventions that they're making are effective. So I think there's a balance between too much pressure on the individual against making sure that you have measures that enable you to measure how effective you are. And it's somewhere in the middle between the two.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot with another question. We're doing some really fascinating research at the moment on HR transformation. What's the next phase? And something that's really coming out is HR's need to work in a much more flexible way. And as part of that conversation, a lot of our member companies are really working so much more towards projects, agile teams, really sort of moving resource, not just within HR, but right across the organization. So what do you think will be the implications if we no longer have, a line manager who is seeing the same team? Your team is changing all the time. Do you have any sense of perhaps how companies might need to think about this?
Well, I think in those circumstances, the importance of mental health awareness for the whole organization becomes much more critical. I think it's very interesting that many of the organizations that we worked with at the Mental Health Foundation, and also Centrica, who we work with privately, both introduced regular program of mental health awareness problems, sending out the message that the organization is encouraging disclosure in a safe and confidential way. I mean, one way, for example, that might meet the kind of issues that you're talking about is having mental health first aiders. Mm-hmm. And mental health first aiders are nominated people who are known to the whole organization, to whom individuals can go and disclose their mental health problems in confidence and feel ensured that they will be able to have their confidence respected, whilst at the same time being able to explore ways in which the corporation as a whole can help them. So in those circumstances, I think mental health awareness, preferably undertaken in collaboration with people like myself who have lived experience of the organization of mental illness, and who can talk about what kind of help the organization should be providing, and to, in the process, open up the whole issue of mental health inside the organization, which until very recently was still a taboo subject. Mm-hmm. I think it becomes much more important for there to be general mental health awareness from top to bottom and bottom to top.
That's a great suggestion. There's a question that we have as well, Michelle, that it would be really interesting to hear from your perspective. So one of our viewers has said, I have an employee with a history of burnout, and I know he has difficulties of dealing with change. He has asked to go back to the office to ensure regular working hours, which we did. But how can I further support him? So someone burnout, but coming back, wanting regular hours, how best to support?
Well, I think this comes back to the point I was making about the issues that a lot of organizations grappling with, the recovery of an individual who's neither perfectly well nor perfectly ill. I think what I'm picking up from that question is that the individual wants to work, but is a little scared that he might not be able to work to the full capacity that the organization normally requires. So this is where the possibility or a temporary or maybe in the long term a permanent reduction of performance targets might be involved. It may be involving flexible working times, or if he's feeling suddenly panicky, a safe space that he can retire to. All of those would be possibilities that you could share with him. But it's quite important, from my perspective as somebody with a lived experience of mental illness, that these adjustments are not imposed by the organization, but that are agreed with the individual. So it sounds to me like the first thing that needs to happen is for that person's supervisor or line manager, or if not that, a specialist HR practitioner should be opening up a dialogue with that person to actually get a better idea what he or she wants in practice. Because one of the reasons why he might want to go back to full hours is because he's scared that his career prospects might be damaged if he doesn't. And I think it's very important, as part of the mental health awareness culture organizations are trying to introduce, that this idea that somehow any admission of mental health problems is going to automatically destroy a person's career prospects inside the organization needs to be addressed, and addressed positively.
And I think this is where our research at the Conference Board has really shown as well the power, the amazing power of when senior people in the organisation do share their own stories. And I think in our last webcast, we did flag that up. There have been some really successful campaigns, and Barclays has been one of the leading international companies doing this, of This Is Me, where people where they've created a platform within the company for people to tell their stories and to do short videos. This has been a part of a larger campaign, and so I think that's very, very powerful, extremely powerful. So thank you, Michelle. I think if we don't seem to have any other questions, I think something that I wanted to just sort of finish up in these last few minutes, and I won't go through the sort of all my slides, but I think that it's also important just to sort of say that you can't expect line managers, you can't develop the whole responsibility of line managers in isolation. And there does have to be, I think, for it to really work, there has to be a corporate-wide approach to well-being and mental health. If the studio would move my slides, that would be really great. So I think I'd just like to share with you this one sort of, in our research, there are some building blocks for mental health and well-being, and these building blocks is what we've seen through the research that we've done. We've done two research reports that are available on our website, but also ongoing discussions with our members, and particularly of these last few months where we've talked to member companies about their efforts in this area. And I think that it's just very important to stress that mental health, that if you are going to do something very meaningful and across perhaps quite a complex and large organisation, you do really have to have a holistic model for health and well-being. And so that this is a consistent understanding, a consistent framework, a consistent language. But you also need to flex it with some regional and cultural nuances. For example, in some countries, mental health may be absolutely taboo. So a holistic model is really important. And looking at the next model, the next slide, you'll see that this is, you don't have to necessarily start from scratch. The World Health Organization has a really great healthy workplace model. And their definition of well-being is this capturing this multi-facet, that it's physical work, that it's personal health, that it's something around the community involvement as well, and that it's what they call psychosocial work environment, which I think is a hard word to say actually. So this is something that you can look at, and so you don't have to necessarily start from scratch. And I think that they also have their principles, that it's, that it's got to be comprehensive, but also participatory and empowering. And I think at the moment, with some of the things that we've seen around inclusion and exclusion, it's really important that workers at all levels are involved in thinking about this framework. And they also, in the WHO's framework, one of the principles is about social justice, that all members of the workplace must be included in the programmes without regard for rank or gender, ethnicity or employment status. And again, I think that's a really important message at the moment. It also, the final sort of framework principle is sustainability, that you need to create this strategy, and incorporate it into your workplace culture and management practices so that it is sustainable over time. And I think that that's easier said than done. And in fact, we will be looking at that in a lot more detail in our next webcast in September, when I'll have the great pleasure of having someone from National Westminster Bank, who were formerly RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland. They have got a really mature health and wellbeing programme that has so many good pointers and good practices, and they're at that point now where they've been doing it for a while, and they're really working hard now to really get it into the cultural DNA of the organisation. I think it will be a really, really interesting webinar. There are companies out there, if we look at the next slide, there are companies out there who are more than willing to share their frameworks. If you go on so many sort of websites of companies, they will often have their framework. So this is one that's out in the physical, in the public domain. It's Merck's, and I love it. So it shows really, really clearly, and this is another factor, to have really clear signposting. And they show people at a glance, it's a fantastic graph, at a glance about what's available and the company approach and what's available in terms of benefits and you know, this whole thing of physical, emotional, and the fact that it's all of a holistic thing. And in my next slide, again, you'll see that this is also Unilever's holistic approach to wellbeing, which is in one of our reports. And they think of wellbeing like a battery. So they talk about it as a sort of a source of energy. And Unilever, again, have a really great signposting process. So I think, so having a definition and a holistic framework of mental health and wellbeing that works for you as a company is couched in the language of your company, and that everybody understands is absolutely vital. And I think as well,
Marion, I just think somebody from the conference board has asked, do we have a link to these reports on the slide? If not, might want to give the title so people can easily find it on the website.
Yes.
Because I think obviously people are going to be keen to tap into this expertise.
Okay, well, I haven't got it on the slides. Very good point. One is moving the dial on mental health and well-being. The other one is what's it called? Something like mental health and well-being in the workplace, I think it's called. Yes, I think it's called mental health and well-being in the workplace. But yes, I should have put that on the slide. So if anyone wants to email me, marion.devine@conferenceboard.org, I will come back to them with pleasure and share those links with them. And I think as well, something about Unilever is that they've linked their sense of well-being to their wider business strategy, and I think again that's something that's really important that companies are doing. So they're focusing on, for example, the notion of healthy change. In one organisation, when they were doing a change management programme, they actually incorporated mental health and well-being into that strategy to talk about healthy change. So moving on to my next slide. There's also this whole point about when you are either scaling up or even starting with some sort of enterprise-wide framework, you do have to build the business case. And I think that in this area, the harder statistics, data, evidence that you can get, the better. You need to obviously assess where is your organisation at the moment. Can you find out within the limits of GDPR and other concerns about confidentiality, but you know, what is the present state of workforce health and well-being? What are some of your hidden costs maybe in things like absenteeism? You know, can you calculate some of these? Can you look into some of your pulse surveys or engagement surveys to find out about what employees think about your current provisions? And I think that drawing on external benchmarks is so useful. And there are, again, a lot of organisations out there that have all sorts of literature that can give you good, solid data about benefits, about impact on productivity, engagement, satisfaction. So draw on those things. And I think that if you can, therefore, in any redesign or introduction of a programme, if you can establish a baseline assessment using this data, that's a very, very powerful starting point for your to ramp up and everything. And I think it's a great way as well to get the buy-in of the business, and maybe to help you in your arguing a case for investment, because we know companies at the moment, you know, are really hanging on to their cash. And in the next slide, you'll just see at a very quick glance, this is one company's roadmap, which is out in the public domain. But they basically, over 2 years, created or extended their well-being initiatives into a global well-being program. So they started, you can see down at the bottom left, they started with their employee population health, they did the analysis, they built the business case, they really got the C-suite absolutely bought in. Then they had all sorts of teams to start designing approaches, to especially as well to look at how to get it into the culture of the organisation. They did their homework. They went and found all sorts of benchmarks, looked at metrics. And I think one of the things they found, and I think this is a great learning point, is that they went for various national and international awards, things like Best Employer for Healthy Lifestyle. And there are sort of various programs out there. And the value of doing this is that in the process of participating in these things, you can get standards and benchmarks and methodologies, which is really a great shortcut, I think. So I think just onto the next slide, very quick point, deep and wide sponsorship and ownership from the leaders at the very top all the way down. Think about networks of ambassadors. Just try and think about people that you can really involve. Don't forget your employee resource groups. And again, we will talk about that in the next webcast with RBS. And then moving on to the next slide, I think just build on a foundation of regional initiatives and best practice. Don't forget that in different parts, if you're in a large organisation, there are probably people out there who are doing some really great things at a local level. So find these, see if they're scalable. Try out different things. You can't have all the best approach, the best answers, but just have a look at what's already going on in your organisation. Don't forget to talk to external organisations, some of those really fantastic charities out there, NGOs that are already working in the field and maybe have some great resources and methodologies. And I think, very definitely don't try to boil the ocean. You have to start where you can start best in your organisation and build up slowly. So I think that's all I want to sort of share at the moment, because we are coming to an end of our time. But I think that we can, in our next 2 webcasts, we can certainly cover in more detail about this whole thing about absolutely ramping up and embedding a health and wellbeing program in your organisation, and NatWest will share with us. And in my last point about the building blocks to monitor and to measure, how you actually kind of get that view through data, through the use of data of what's going on, as a way of both seeing how effective your initiatives are, and also just trying to progress your initiatives. So I'm delighted actually we're going to have 2 people from National Lloyds Banking, and they're going to talk about how they're using analytics to really help them in their wellbeing program, but also particularly on a sort of preventative basis as well. So I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our webcast today, and I just wanted to, it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour in terms of having a global framework, but I felt it was important to put the context of the line manager into that wider context, so that you can really, they are the linchpin, but it does have to be in this wider framework of support and an understanding of the importance of mental health and well-being. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Michelle. Thank you, Michelle, so much for sharing your expertise. Yes. I'd also like to really encourage everybody to fill in the evaluation, because that would be so useful for us. Do please think about joining us on September the 2nd. So we'll look at National Westminster's experiences here of a very integrated and very well embedded wellbeing program. And on October the 8th, we will have we'll look at a data-led approach to a better understanding of mental health and wellbeing with the Lloyds Banking Group. So please do join us then, and thank you for joining us today. So thank you, Michelle.
Cheers.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.